These NBA players were once atop of the world, but before we had a chance to blink, had vanished from the face of the earth, and no one fits this mold better than Kenneth Faried. Just hearing the name of the Manimal likely rings some bells because just a couple of years ago, he was gracing the Olympic team's floor after signing a $50 million deal. I mean, Faried was a beast. It seemed like every game this guy would play, you would see some freakish putback poster with a double-double to finish the night. But despite maintaining his health, Faried vanished from the league without any warning. After giving up on the Carmelo Anthony era, the 2011 Nuggets were a group that was left scrambling for answers. And with the 22nd pick in the draft, you weren't going to have a chance at any picture-perfect draft pick to fit the new young core. But thanks to Kenneth Faried's instant motor, he didn't need to be perfect. Standing at just 6'8" at the power forward position with no jump shot at all, Faried was a major question mark about whether this player build really works. But after setting the Division I rebounding record, it was clear that he would make it work regardless, because he was a freak athlete that worked harder than anyone on the floor. Despite losing Carmelo Anthony, the Nuggets now ran by a weird mismatch of talents, with Gallinari providing wing scoring and Ty Lawson running the points. They may not have been a championship contender, but at 38 and 28, these guys were pretty damn good, and more so, were pretty damn fun, with arguably no one more of a fan favorite than the Manimal.
Lawson, Faried's got it into Fernandez. Whoa! And Faried, his first 2 points as a Denver Nugget.
Kenneth Faried made a name for himself in the NBA as a guy who could come in and make those big-time energy plays despite his small stature. As instantly one of the best offensive rebounders in the league, and one of the better rim runners in transition due to his freakish athleticism, Faried quickly earned a starting spot as the team would move from Nene and allow Faried to take a stab at it. Putting up just under 10 and 8 as a rookie, coming in third for Rookie of the Year, Faried was about as fun as it gets. As a guy who was in there to 120% at all times, despite starting, he was oftentimes playing just over 20 minutes a night, which led to some crazy stat lines like a 27 and 17 rebound night while playing just 22 minutes. The Nuggets season would end at the hand of the Lakers in the first round, but it's hard to say that the Nuggets play was anything but shocking. This was a team that was starting a 5'10 point guard and a 6'8 power forward that they just drafted 22nd overall. This was a team that had moved on from one of the best scorers of the era with little to show for it. And this was a team that managed to push the Kobe and Powell Lakers to 7 games. These guys weren't just a gimmicky fun team. This was shockingly effective basketball, and no one committed to winning more than the guy who was clearly dumping his heart out on the floor.
Jamal Murray on cue there. Faried fighting. He's the only one. There's one still with it.
The Nuggets, having seen what their existing roster could do, pulled the trigger on a move with the intention of winning now, bringing in the veteran leadership of Andre Iguodala, who fit on a team whose identity was selflessness, pace, and high energy play. Faried's growth would continue climbing to 11.5 and 9 with a steal and a block a game in just 28 minutes, while being recognized as a top 20 defender in the league in the deep boy voting. The Nuggets had a bit of an adjustment period, but with a 31-6 finish to the season, it's clear that these Nuggets were the real deal. With sky-high expectations at the 3 seed, this is where the Nuggets would unfortunately flop at their peak. Symbolically, the Warriors had the Nuggets' number. Despite being a young, unproven team, these guys were playing the most efficient basketball in the league, which is easy to see in hindsight, of course. But they also put a few less efficient teams out of commission in the analytic-driven NBA we see today, and the Nuggets may have been the first domino to fall. The Nuggets saw their future in a dimmer light than their 57-win record may suggest, firing Coach of the Year George Karl after Andre Iguodala departed from the team, and with an injured Gallinari, this made way for Faried to have a career year, averaging just under 14 and 9 in 27 minutes. Faried was recognized as one of the better talents in the NBA, as the Nuggets had the freedom to let him cook a bit, although never being ball dominant by any means. But this was a year of many 2020 games that kept the Nuggets games interesting throughout their down season. Faried would be selected onto the Olympic team this offseason after his best year in the league so far, and would also earn a whopping $50 million extension which was certainly a hefty bag before we got numb to the GTA level NBA contracts. At the time where Faried was at his highest, without us knowing, the end of Faried would effectively take place during the Taco Bell commercial that offseason, as the Nuggets would select the man who, alongside Yusuf Nurkic, would soon replace Faried in this Denver lineup. Although not visible right away, Faried would play the next 2 seasons at a pretty similar level. At 12 and 8-ish, this was really about as productive as an energy guy could be despite how good he was at it. And as Faried battled nagging back injuries resulting in his declining numbers in the 2016-2017 season, the Nuggets quickly noticed that Faried's backup were far more efficient than the Manimal ever was, dropping to just 9 points per game this season and then down to 6 in the following. When questioned about Faried's lack of clock at just 28 years old, Coach Malone would go as far as to ask why he should play him. His younger, more versatile replacements were just flat out better. Faried, although capable of big-time energizing plays, was just far too here and there to be a consistent piece. Although being a great offensive rebounder, as a smaller, undersized forward, it wasn't unusual to see him get bodied on the defensive glass. He may have been able to put up 14 a game, but that was really all the points that you were going to be able to scratch without a post move or a jump shot, or anything that isn't putbacks or fast breaks. Faried's game was far too one-dimensional to be a success in the modern NBA. After being traded from the Nuggets, Faried would find his final home in the league with the one team out of any who would be able to turn this thing around. After seeing what they did with PJ Tucker as an undersized big, and Clint Capella as an athletic rim-running 5, if any team could save Faried, it was the Houston Rockets. And this looks like it really was the comeback of his career. At 13 and 8 in Houston, Faried would really seem to be back doing what he does best. But even with the perfect fit team, Faried's flaws were not going away. This guy was an analytical nightmare that frankly had been overrated before the league's overhaul. Faried was not a consistent offensive threat whatsoever, who couldn't be consistently trusted to keep his matchup off of the offensive glass. While not having on-ball or help defense at an NBA level, he could produce with minutes on the floor, but he wasn't going to produce to a high enough level to be worth giving minutes to. And just like that, Faried was done in the NBA for good. It may have seemed like a shocking turnaround to some, but the reason is really quite obvious. Faried was really never as good as we thought, and it wasn't necessarily the age of basketball analytics that changed it. It was the analytics that exposed that. After receiving a major payday and honors that he probably was a bit early to receive, Faried coasted his way out of NBA basketball by never adding a single improvement to his game. Faried was really what looked like a step or two away from being a star, but turned around and ran back to the bottom before achieving it. But in the case of Roy Hibbert, I don't think we've ever seen a star fall off this quickly and this brutally. The early 2010s Pacers at this point are certainly an underrated roster that often gets viewed as a young Paul George-led squad that was the Big Heat's punching bag before the NBA Finals. But the way that this team found success was so much different from anything we've seen in the league that it deserves its own rewind. Of course, offensively, this was Paul George's team as he emerged as a superstar, and George Hill as well as David West were really underrated players that could score the ball, and in Hill's case, facilitate the ball pretty well. The team with a pretty strong guard, wing, post trio could score adequately well with their very slow pace of play. But where this team was defined was their historically good defensive scheme, which was essentially bulletproof. George Hill was the first or second worst defender in this system, and that really says a lot, because as a pretty decently sized guard with a freakish 6'9" wingspan, Hill wasn't a ball stopper per se, but could act as the perfect point of attack defender to funnel the ball where the defense wants it. Lance Stevenson, although the worst player in the starting lineup, was pretty damn athletic and played above his size of sort. As a guy who could switch on to point guards, and also guard LeBron James, Lance provided some unique perimeter versatility that when matched with George Hill and Paul George created the best perimeter trio in the NBA. As we all know, Paul George is a long athletic ball stopper who's been one of the premier perimeter defenders for a billion years now. But the unique advantage this trio provides is that they were big and athletic enough to force you to slow down and play their brand of basketball. Now playing at turtle speed, you had to meet up with David West, who is just a grade A bruiser, defensive rebounder, and kind of like a 1990s 4. And then finally, of course, we get to Roy Hibbert. Hibbert was really your defensive anchor in the purest form, with a single word describing his game perfectly: verticality. Hibbert was 7'2", large and in charge, and could basically tree up and prevent shots at the basket better than anyone in the league. Hibbert was essentially a one-trick pony, but was the anchor of a perfect defensive ecosystem that turned this adequately talented team into an enormous overachiever. I'm explaining this not to nerd out on you, although admittedly I do enjoy it, but rather to explain the story that this 12 points and 8 rebound average doesn't tell you. When it comes to a crucial piece of any team, Hibbert was so good at the core part of his game that he was essentially a star in the league. Entering the league at a time where the Pacers were growing with their emerging star in Danny Granger, Roy Hibbert would grow alongside them, peaking out at around 13-8 in the 2010-2011 season, where he would pretty much remain for the remainder of his prime, struggling to shoot over 50% from the field, with about 70 to 80% of his shots coming within 10 feet of the basket. Roy was a pretty bad offensive player all in all, but as the Pacers would rise to 42-24 in the 2012 season, Hibbert was so recognized as a terrifying rim protector that he would be selected to his first All-Star game. Hibbert was so good at getting big that LeBron James would question the legality of Hibbert's defense altogether. See, Roy Hibbert was the primary culprit, taking advantage of the verticality rule. Although as long as I've watched the game at least, the defender is entitled from the ground to the ceiling when set and jumping off the ground. As a 280-pound, 7'2" giant, Roy would oftentimes get away with a little extra contact, given that his arms were still straight up in the air. Given this extra leeway, his pretty good defensive instincts and monstrous stature, this guy was a tree in the paint. Hibbert and the Pacers would match up with the Heat for the first time in 2012, and this time was really just a test run. But at 12-12, this was a display that Hibbert could take advantage of the Heat's lack of size, while they were the team to beat not only in the East, but in the entire NBA. The following season is when the keys would unexpectedly be placed in the hands of emerging star Paul George, and somewhat on accident, this would give birth to the #1 defense in the NBA at a defensive rating of 99.8. With a pretty unproven team with little offensive firepower, this is when the Pacers really began to shock the world. As games slowed down in the postseason, these Pacers began eating offenses alive, holding the Hawks to under 100 points in 5 games. The Pacers were able to beat the hell out of Atlanta in 6. Now matching up with the 2-seeded Knicks, these guys were able to pull it off again despite matching up with a prime Carmelo Anthony. Now in the Eastern Conference Finals, this thing got a whole lot more interesting. Although on paper the Heat easily win the matchup at like 3 or 4 positions, the Pacers were silently their kryptonite. Paul George and LeBron was a fun current versus future matchup on the wing, but the Pacers' X factor was Roy Hibbert, and he played out of his mind in this series. Roy abused their undersized lineup with 22-10 in an extremely out-of-character dominating performance, shooting 56% from the field. But for a team this young and unproven to beat one of the most talented rosters ever, they had to play to their strengths. And this thing went about as well as it could have gone. With timely excellence from PG and the Pacers slowing down everyone not named LeBron James, it took an all-time series from LeBron in the best season of his career and 7 full games to beat down on a Pacers team that was relying on a 32-year-old David West and a 22-year-old Paul George. This team was extraordinary for finding the success they found, and Hibbert was the centric point of it. The young Pacers would grow the next year to a first-place finish at 56-26, while Roy Hibbert would play some of the better ball of his career for the first half of the year, earning another All-Star selection. What became very strange in the conclusion of the season was that Roy Hibbert was in a massive slump to end the year. Slumps are nothing out of the ordinary, but for a big guy whose game revolves around paint mashing like a 2K player, seeing his shooting percentage fall below 35% to conclude the year and falling from 7 to 4 rebounds per game was extremely weird. Slumps oftentimes are mental for athletes, but for a big, physically imposing guy to be this physically unimposing on a night's notice, something must be seriously up. As the Pacers ended the playoffs, the Hibbert problems would only be worse as this 1 seed would be pushed to 7 games. Going down 3-2 in the series, the Pacers were forced to bench Hibbert, scoring 0 points with 0 boards and 4 fouls in 12 minutes. The problems were clear. Hibbert looked disgustingly poor offensively, scoring just 5 a game on under 40% from the field, while only being able to grab 3.7 rebounds per game at 7'2". Mentally, something was clearly off for Hibbert. And worse, his defensive impact was non-existent this series for one reason, and that is the floor spacing of the Atlanta Hawks. When pulling Hibbert away from the basket defensively, he was absolutely terrible. Hibbert was strictly a one-trick pony as a rim protector standing under the basket. But with a 5-out offense, the Hawks were able to stick in a series that in all likelihood should have been a sweep. The Pacers would move on, but Hibbert's struggles certainly didn't get any better. With another 0 points, 0 rebound game with 5 fouls in 18 minutes against the Wizards, Hibbert was being completely ripped apart online and in the media. Hibbert would promise to improve his play, and for a night that seemed to be the case with a 28-point, 9-rebound outing, but what became clear was that Hibbert was unable to maintain anywhere near this production. The Pacers would advance to once again match up against Miami, where once again eyes were on Hibbert as he was their primary option and most valuable player in the Miami series the year prior. But Hibbert was a complete roller coaster, putting up pretty average Roy Hibbert stats with another 0-point performance in Game 2. The Pacers completely lacked the firepower to make this one a series, going home in 6. All in all, it's safe to say that this was a serious disaster of a postseason for Roy Hibbert. Many people like to point to the difference made by the NBA setting a focus on cracking down on the strictness of the verticality rule, and although it's true that Hibbert was frequently caught up in foul trouble, it's hard to solely tie this rule change to his disastrous turnaround. Hibbert would meet with team psychologists frequently. While friends and teammates say the mental slump he was in was very serious. As the play got worse, the feedback from the fans would get more cruel, and as a guy who couldn't shut that off, it turned into an all-around downward spiral. The mental struggles, a slight altering of foul calling in a way that didn't help him, and a shift in play style expanding out to the three-point line, sure as hell all fed into each other, leading to one of the most instant collapses in basketball history. The Pacers would roll with Hibbert for a final season after George snapped his leg in half, falling to the 7th best defense in the NBA. Before moving on from Hibbert in 2016, only to climb to the 3rd best defense in the league. Kind of a giveaway sign in how just a couple of years, the immobility of Hibbert not only caused him to fall from his spot as one of the best defensive players in the league, but also caused him to drop all the way to being pretty below average. Pretty crazy. Hibbert would be moved to the Lakers in 2016, and as you may remember, this year was absolutely pitiful. Putting up just 6 and 5 a night while starting 81 games, Roy Hibbert had officially completely fallen off. Playing just one more season in the NBA, Hibbert in a few years had went from the Miami Heat stopper to a guy that doesn't deserve a roster spot. The reason we've gone into the detail that we have on this guy is because his fall off had so many different factors that all led to the same result. I like Roy Hibbert. In a way, this Indiana Pacers squad felt like they were showing us what the grit and grind of a traditional 1990s basketball team would look like in the modern NBA. This was a very cool team for a basketball nerd, and Roy Hibbert was certainly the anchor that this team played around. But had this not been a Frank Vogel defensive masterpiece, and had this not been the absolute perfect fit for a tree in the lane, you wouldn't have been able to recreate this on any other team ever. Roy Hibbert in a way was overrated in his prime, to put it bluntly. For a time, I personally thought this guy was the best defender in the NBA, given that every factor on his team allowed him to reign supreme. But Hibbert was no Ben Wallace, Joel Embiid, Rudy Gobert. Hell, for a while you could say Hassan Whiteside. Hibbert was a slow one-trick pony that the league quickly moved away from. With a mix of mental struggles causing his early decline and a faster NBA that no longer needed his services, Roy Hibbert's one of those guys the NBA had to press the delete button on. When talking about players who vanished, one that I certainly remember fondly is the forgotten three-point sniper Michael Redd. This guy was ahead of his time as a big physical two-guard who could create space and kill you with a jump shot, who also still found big-time success, averaging up close to 30 a game in the 2000s as a guy that nobody ever talks about. Drafted in the 2nd round of the 2000 NBA draft, Redd faced a limited playing time as a rookie, as he was behind the established all-star Ray Allen. Yet, in Bucks practices, Redd impressed by consistently challenging Allen, Glenn Robinson, and other teammates, proving he had more potential than anticipated. Head coach George Karl took note, giving Redd additional minutes. In his 2nd season, Redd's potential began to translate into tangible production as he averaged 11.4 points per game with an impressive 44.4 shooting from three-point range. In a breakout performance on February 20th, Red set a then NBA record by making 8 3-balls in the fourth quarter against the Rockets. By October 2002, his talent had drawn attention from around the league. The Dallas Mavericks offered him a 4-year, $12 million contract, but Milwaukee, recognizing his value, matched the offer to keep him on their roster. The 03-04 season marked a turning point for Red. With Ray Allen traded to Seattle in one of the worst trades in NBA history, Red stepped into a starting role, averaging 21.7 points per game, and earning his first All-Star appearance to help ease the pain of the trade a little bit. His scoring ability became his signature, particularly his deadly shooting from the perimeter, which Bucks fans would quickly come to rely on throughout some of the worst years in their franchise's history. After the 04-05 season, Red faced a career-defining decision. He had a chance to join his hometown Cleveland Cavaliers and team up with the young LeBron James, but Red, prioritizing loyalty, chose to stay with the Bucks, signing a 6-year, $91 million contract despite Cleveland's offer. With a chance to really make himself relevant, his decision did not bring any results if his goal was to win in Milwaukee. Even with the first overall pick, the Bucks would pass on guards like Chris Paul and Darren Williams for Andrew Bogut, whose career was mediocre, although snapping his arm in half definitely didn't help. Over the next few years, Red continued to elevate his game. In the 2006-2007 season, he averaged a career-high 26.7 points per game, including a Bucks record 57-point game against the Utah Jazz on November 11, 2006, breaking Kareem's long-standing record. However, the Bucks struggled as a team, and injuries eventually took their toll on Red's career. On January 25, 2009, Red tore his ACL and MCL in his left knee, ending his season prematurely. He attempted to come back the following season, but tragically retore the same ligaments on January 10, 2010. These injuries forced Red to miss significant playing time, and he only returned in the 2010-11 season, playing just 10 games trying to regain his footing. Finishing his career with a single season as an average role player on the Steve Nash Suns, Michael Red hung them up as sadly more of a what-if that nobody really cared to watch. Completely wasting his career on the Bucks during their down years, made for a career that nobody really recognized, and as injuries derailed him, this thing ended on a low note. Unfortunately, the world was robbed of the LeBron and Michael Red duo that could have very well surged his career and altered NBA history in the process, meshing the best point forward ever with a guy who can put up points in an absolute hurry. But as we sit now, the insane talents of Michael Red were only used to make a bad small market team a little less boring before we never talked about him again. For a very brief while in the NBA, there was really a world where Nikola Pekovic was one of the best centers in the league. Was this an absurdly weak time for the position? Yes. Were the Timberwolves one of the most mediocre teams in the league? Yes. But the front court pairing of Kevin Love and Nikola Pekovic was one of the most fun Wolves squads of their sucktastic history prior to Towns. Peck came into the league after extending his EuroLeague career post being an early second-round pick, and didn't lace up for his first NBA game until 25 years old. Peck really didn't play much entering the NBA. Despite looking like a guy who could be a terrifying defensive talent with no touch, he was the complete opposite as a guy who could score in the post while being a defensive liability. It didn't take too long for Pekovic to quickly shine, as he basically entered the NBA at his peak and only improved as minutes allowed. Jumping to 14-7 the next year, Pekovic built a reputation as the strongest player in the league, hovering around 300 pounds, which was basically the basis for his entire game. Pekovic had some okay post moves, but really the fun and most effective way for Pekovic to impact the game was to utilize his strength for positioning. This resulted in him upping his scoring totals to 16 and 17 points per game over the next 2 seasons, off of really just basic hook shots and lightly contested layups and dunks over players he just manhandled. It was pretty sweet, really. Pekovic couldn't really jump over a piece of paper, so his rebounding and shot blocking numbers never translated too well. But on the offensive glass, this guy could certainly worm to the basket. When it came to keeping guys off the glass, Pekovic was a big body box out dude who made way for Kevin Love to put up some insane rebounding totals. Although having the reputation as a terrible defender, I really don't believe that's too true. As a guy who couldn't move an inch in the post, Pekovic was very good at defending bigs one-on-one on the block, although he was admittedly pretty useless as a help defender due to his lack of athleticism. Pekovic played at a time where he benefited from playing a bunch of comparatively bad centers. During his prime, you could argue that there wasn't a big guy in the top 10 of the NBA. Playing at a time with low competition, where he also didn't need to guard guys on the three-point line, it's safe to say that in 2014, Pekovic was really like right outside of that top 5 mark in the NBA, potential to climb even more if you got him forward like Serge Ibaka to cover his back. However, after 2014, Pekovic would suffer multiple ankle injuries on his massive 300-pound frame, as his stats fell to 12, then to 4 points per game after receiving a massive $60 million contract for his timely play. Peck really peaked early before being erased from the NBA, but for reasons covered earlier, peaking the same year as Roy Hibbert as a really slow, stocky big, it's hard to imagine that Pekovic wouldn't have gotten the same treatment. Peck's decline out of the NBA is a bit of a mystery to most, although quite explainable. But despite his rather sudden and dramatic decline, it was his post-playing days that really made the noise. Post-playing days, Nikola Pekovic has been investigated for his ties to organized crime group, namely the Kavik clan, one of the most dangerous and influential criminal groups in the Balkans. The clan operates primarily in Montenegro, Serbia, and Albania, but has connections throughout Europe, especially in the legal drug trade. The clan has been heavily involved in trafficking drugs like cocaine and heroin, using its extensive networks to distribute these substances across Europe. They also have been implicated in arms smuggling and money laundering, further solidifying their role in organized crime. The most publicized incident linking Pekovic to organized crime occurred in 2021, when Montenegrin police seized 2 of his luxury vehicles, both tied to the clan. These vehicles were reportedly owned by 2 prominent figures within the group, suggesting that Pekovic had some level of involvement or association with them. These individuals were not only known for their involvement in drug trafficking, but were also linked to multiple violent crimes. Members of the group have also been implicated in assassinations, violent turf wars with rival gang organizations, and other illegal enterprises. Rival gangs have feuded for years, claiming many lives in the region. This criminal rivalry has involved multiple murders and bombings, with the groups battling for control of drug routes and trafficking networks in the region. The violence between these 2 factions has been so intense that it has spilled over into neighboring countries, making it a focal point for law enforcement agencies across Europe. While there is no direct evidence linking Pekovic to these violent acts, the association with known members has raised serious questions about his involvement. Authorities have been investigating whether Pekovic had any business dealings or personal connections with clan members, though as of now, he has not been formally charged with any criminal activity. Pekovic was surely one interesting case that I wouldn't want to butt heads with on or off the floor. Isaiah Thomas sure had one insane run in the NBA that left us with one of the most superhuman seasons that the NBA scriptwriters must have worked overtime on. But sadly, just a few years withdrawn from a season at the top of the league in MVP voting, IT is out of basketball completely. Isaiah had an uphill battle from the start, being drafted with the very last pick in the 2011 draft, before having to fight for any playing time at all in Sacramento. The Kings were not known for their smart draft picks, but in 2011, they were the only guys who saw this diamond in the rough. It's hard to blame any other team, as a guy who's 5'9", with the game revolving primarily around his fearless finishing inside, there was no comparable players to really point to in the NBA, but this thing worked, and worked big time. As a double-digit scorer his first 2 years in the league, Isaiah would climb over 20 a game in just his 3rd season. The Kings, having struck gold, had to screw up their future as they do, trading away their cornerstone for next to nothing, and landing on the Suns during the peak of their disaster years. There was no point for him to play alongside Goran Dragic and Eric Bledsoe, so within a single season, IT would be moved to the Boston Celtics, where he finally found his home. IT had the chains off. In an all-star season, averaging 22 points per game, this was only a sign of the things to come, because he was really only getting started. Thomas showed his ability to shine when the lights were at their brightest, highlighted by a Game 3 40 bomb in the first round against the Atlanta Hawks. But having seen what Isaiah can do with the ball in his hands, the offensive mastermind Brad Stevens cooked up an offensive system that maximized his 5'9" star. With a pair of ball stoppers in Avery Bradley and Marcus Smart, the Celtics were able to hide who is quite possibly the worst defender in the NBA, while on the other side of the floor maximizing his offensive ability. With the spread isolation, spread pick and roll centric offense, Isaiah Thomas went absolutely nuclear, while Brad Stevens gave him the keys to do whatever the hell he wanted. As the highest usage player in the league, the goal was to constantly get Isaiah Thomas going downhill. Despite his short height crippling his defensive game, being quicker than most guards while having one of the best floaters I've ever seen worked him wonders. Thomas put up a ridiculous 29 points per game this season, which at 5'9" is insane, but just seems to get crazier and crazier the more you dig into it. At 46 and 38% shooting splits, IT was very efficient for a guy shooting at the volume that he was. But at 90% from the line, with a 62.5% true shooting, He was a statistical anomaly. Hell, he even toppled Stephen Curry's 62.4% this year, and that's with the prime KD to take defensive attention away. Isaiah Thomas's 2017 campaign was so ridiculously efficient with his ability to knock down pull-up three balls and mid-range jumpers, while forcing contact and getting to the line well, all while finishing an inhuman amount of layups for a 5'9" guy. I mean, in any way you look at this, I don't know how he could have played any better. And had his career been stretched out, I really doubt he would have ever been able to topple this. I mean, it was that much of a statistical anomaly. IT would earn the name King of the Fourth Quarter for putting up the second most fourth quarter points ever in a season behind Kobe Bryant, who did it with a fraction of the efficiency. With monstrous moments like his 29.4th against the Miami Heat, this was unlike anything we've ever seen. And after doing the impossible, IT put on a playoff performance that will be etched into the history books forever. Tragically, just one day before the start of the playoffs, IT would lose his sister in a car accident at just 22 years old. Being held while in tears on the bench by teammate Avery Bradley, IT would give us a moment that was bigger than basketball. While wiping away his tears, Isaiah Thomas would put together a 33-point Game 1 explosion while mourning the grief that most couldn't imagine. After attending the funeral, IT would fly back to Boston the same day before suiting up and heading out in Game 1 the following round against the Wizards. And with some ultra-physical players and the defensive impact of John Wall, IT went to war for another 33 points while losing his tooth in the process. At this point, it's safe to say that IT had nothing left to prove to any person in that building. But on the night of his sister's birthday in Game 2, Thomas put together one of the greatest performances in NBA history. With 53 points, including 33 in the second half and overtime, IT left everything on the floor, battling through physical, mental, and emotional damage, to put together a performance that was enough to bring a grown man to tears. IT would play through a 7-game nail-biter in one of the best series in history to advance to the Eastern Conference before, sadly, the train would come off the rails. Due to a hip injury, Thomas would be sidelined. Having played through severe pain to where he eventually couldn't walk, Thomas had caused severe damage, which wouldn't be noticed until after Thomas was traded to Cleveland in the following offseason for Kyrie Irving. Playing just 32 games the following year, Isaiah straight up didn't look like the same player. Scoring 15 on just 37% from the field, Thomas would be dealt to LA mid-season, then Denver, then Washington, and around the league, quickly diminishing his on-the-court production. Flat out, without the air control and quickness from his diminishing lower body, Isaiah Thomas was one of the worst players in the NBA as an inefficient point who couldn't facilitate well naturally given his physical disadvantages, and just a couple years after doing the impossible, IT was out of the league for good. The answer to the IT mystery is pretty clear as we've covered. Playing on his injured hip, giving us some of the most memorable moments in basketball history, was one of the most badass cinematic moments in sports history. But it came at the cost of his own future. The irreversible damage suffered to his lower body ended the IT miracle run, and although the Celtics dumping off their star after leaving his heart on the floor and destroying his body for his team was in incredibly bad taste, the same heart that etched his name in history also costed him his basketball career. It's incredibly unfortunate that IT never came back anywhere near that Superhuman run in 2017, and honestly, for a run like this to ever happen again, the odds are very slim, and for a player to emotionally entice the world the way that IT did is really close to impossible. The players we covered here today are sadly remembered now, just as a reminder that nothing lasts forever, so cherish every minute of it. Thank you for watching if you made it this far, and I'll see you boys in the next one. Peace out.